Good morning, everyone. We are just going to be letting folks in now over the next couple minutes, and then we will get this the program for today started. Thank you for joining us. Welcome for those of you just joining us. We are going to start this program in a couple moments. If we can just hang tight. We have about twice as many attendees, I think, still looking to join us. Good morning, everyone. It looks like we still have some attendees logging in. I think we'll get started here in just about a minute. We have a big program today, so we want to make sure we get to everyone. All right, I think we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Let's Build It webinar on incentives for middle housing construction. I'm your MC this morning. My name is Miranda Bateshell. I'm the planning director for the city of Wilsonville. I am very honored to be asked to MC today's event in recognition of the city of Wilsonville's longtime investment in middle housing. We have historically included middle housing in a lot of our neighborhoods. And now we are in the midst of adopting a lot of new changes in light of House Bill 2001 and the city's recently adopted Equitable Housing Strategic Plan. I know a lot of you attended last year's event. I know here in Wilsonville, we still talk about how great that webinar was. And I'm really happy to report that we have a great lineup of speakers again this year. You're going to hear today from experts from various industries who are all working on middle housing production and building it on the ground. Today, you're going to hear us talk about recent legislation, which has, as you know, increased our opportunities for even more middle housing types to be built in our region and across the state. We will also talk about housing variety and affordability, home ownership, efficient use of land, and the role of different players in the construction of middle housing. So before we get started today, the program's question and answer will continue after the presentations. So we encourage you to please ask a question. You'll do that by hovering over your screen and where the Q&A button pops up. Please use that to type in your question, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of all of the presentations. Also note that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on HBA and on Metro's website. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize and thank the elected officials who are on the call today. Their names are here on the screen. So welcome and thank you for your commitment to housing and middle housing. Now it's my privilege to introduce Mayor Jason Snider, who will provide the opening remarks for our webinar. Mayor Jason Snider serves as mayor of the city of Tigard, a diverse community of over 54,000 people that has been at the vanguard of smart housing policy in Oregon. He has been a champion for housing equity and access throughout his career in public service, from serving on the city council in 2018 when it re-legalized middle housing, to overseeing the adoption of the city's first affordable housing plan as Tigard's mayor. Thank you and welcome, Mayor Snider.
Mayor Snyder, you're muted.
Thank you for that. Haven't done that in a year, but first time for everything. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and the kind introduction. I want to start by talking about Tigard's experiences and what we've done. I think this is an important way for both the development community more broadly and for cities and elected officials to be thinking about the kinds of things that they can do to incentivize and make middle housing happen. And I'll start with talking about goal 10 of our city's comprehensive plan, which is to provide opportunities to develop a variety of housing types that meet the needs, preferences, and financial capabilities of Tigard's present and future residents. And that's really a guiding point that we sort of constantly have to keep in our mind. And we've long been committed to that goal. We were one of the first cities in the state and only the second in our region to offer tax exemptions for affordable housing. We began that in 1996, way before my time. However, throughout my time on the city council and now as mayor, we've furthered our commitment to reaching our goal of housing all of Tigard and all of Tigard's residents. In 2018, our housing options project updated and modernized our development code to allow middle housing across the city. That work proceeded, and I've been told also helped inspire state action through House Bill 2001, which probably most everyone on the webinar today is familiar with. So some of the highlights of our housing options work included the following. So these are things that you should be thinking about either as a development partner or as an elected official. One is easing the path to constructing ADUs, including allowing 2 ADUs per lot. We legalized cottage clusters, courtyard units, and quads in our residential zones. We implemented clear and objective standards for the approval of housing development. We reduced, or in some cases eliminated entirely, our off-street parking requirements for housing. We streamlined our development standards for apartments. We removed all discriminatory references to housing tenure in our code. And we removed the distinctions between household living and group living and consolidating residential use under one use category. And shortly after we adopted these broad housing reforms with the support of a grant from DLCD under House Bill 4006, we adopted our city's first affordable housing plan. However, we did not simply adopt this plan to voice support for affordable housing. We immediately did work that adopted many of its recommendations, which included a full exemption from city SDCs for affordable housing. The city had already adopted this one in 2017. The adoption of a 1% construction excise tax to fund affordable housing programs. We did that in 2019. The election of joint entitlement under the Community Development Block Grant Program. We did that in 2020. We created a set aside of tax increment financing for affordable housing in one of our 2 redevelopment areas in the Tigard Triangle. We did that in 2020. We expanded the city's existing tax exemption for affordable housing to include land banking. We did that in 2019. And then we exempted smaller ADUs from city SDCs in 2019. We also adopted density and height bonuses and parking reductions for affordable housing in our downtown plan district. That was done in 2019 as well. And we're currently preparing to launch an affordable home ownership program through a local community land trust that will provide permanently protected housing opportunities for our working families. Earlier this year, the Tigard City Council took two important steps that will provide further policy guidance in coming years. The first was the adoption of updates to our citywide housing needs analysis and Goal 10 housing of our comprehensive plan. The second is an ambitious concept plan for the city's two remaining urban reserves, collectively known, we refer to them as River Terrace 2.0. And with this concept plan, we look forward to furthering housing opportunity and access by building an inclusive and welcoming neighborhood for everyone. We look forward to continuing the conversation on housing opportunity and equity with all of our regional partners, including Metro, our neighboring cities, the development community, our residents, and of course, all of you joining us here today. And I do want to emphasize that last point about working with everyone. I just had a meeting with a builder in the last couple of months where they came and just said, you know, we know what you're trying to achieve, but the way you have this thing working with SDCs, not only does it not make any sense to us, but it's actually disincentivizing what you want to see built. And having those kinds of conversations, I encourage the development community and elected officials in cities to really engage in those conversations. On a personal note, I will also share that I've experienced many of these challenges firsthand. I had never intended to be a missing middle housing developer, but I own a number of rental properties with my wife throughout the region. And we had one that was on a large lot in Tigard, and I thought I was going to split the lot and maybe build a duplex on it. That was sort of my idea. And when I asked a development partner in the area to look at it, he came back to me about 3 months after we had authorized the cottage cluster land use and said, did you know the city of Tigard allows cottage clusters? And I said, well, I did actually know that because I helped pass it, but I didn't really think about it for myself. So in the last 2 years, we've moved forward in developing that property. And I've experienced many of the challenges that we're going to be talking today firsthand, whether it's financing these projects, which are not really well understood by some traditional lending institutions, all the way to the challenges with trying to figure out how to pay for and finance SDCs a year before you're going to have a certificate of occupancy. All those things and many more, you all know better than I, but I will say as an elected official, it's been eye-opening for me to experience some of those things and not just hear about them. So really look forward to the session this morning, and thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Mayor Snider. Thank you for so eloquently framing our discussion this morning and for your strong leadership on housing in Tigard and in our region. Our first topic this morning for the webinar will cover House Bill 2001 and Senate Bill 458 and cottage clusters. It will be presented by Roseanne Johnson of the Home Builders Association of Metropolitan Portland and Jesse Russell of Hiatus Homes. Roseanne Johnson is with the Government Affairs team at the Home Builders Association of Metropolitan Portland. HBA and its counterpart State Trade Association, Oregon Home Builders, championed both House Bill 2001 and Senate Bill 458 for increasing a variety of both rental and homeownership opportunities. Jesse Russell is managing partner of the Hiatus Capital Fund and the chief executive for Hiatus Homes. Mr. Russell brings 20 plus years of experience in executive level leadership, project management, construction, and land development to Hiatus Homes and the Hiatus Capital Fund. He is a thought leader in the design and development of small spaces and communities, and is an advocate for people living in smaller, more efficient houses. He is a philosophical leader in the shifting movement and how people view housing, and more importantly, how they live their lives. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Miranda. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Roseanne Johnson with the Home Builders Association Government Affairs team. And I just want to, first of all, say thank you to Metro for underwriting with HBA the expenses and resources that went into this event, as well as all of our presenters and our elected officials. On behalf of HBA, we do want to recognize all of our electeds that joined us this morning, including Washington County Chair Catherine Harrington. And we do want to acknowledge that there may have been some that didn't make it onto the slide. And so for that, I will apologize in advance. So with that, we'll want to just provide a brief cursory overview of middle housing in the state of Oregon. The two landmark legislation pieces that were passed within the last couple of years. Next slide. So the two pieces of legislation that I'm going to provide a rough overview on, just to set the stage for what the rest of our presenters will be speaking about, is first of all, House Bill 2001, which Mayor Snyder referenced, passed in 2019, which allows for this, the hashed markings of middle housing down in the visual at the bottom of your screen, which many of you have probably already seen thanks to Opticos and their design imaging team. So trademark copyright goes to them. And really middle housing being anything besides your duplex or besides your single family detached home product and your high-rise apartment buildings. So everything in between is what we consider middle housing. And then the state of Oregon went further and helped us as community and development and jurisdictional staff and electeds to help define what that really means for Oregon. So then 2 years later, so that this recent legislative session down in Salem, the legislators passed a second companion bill to House Bill 2001 called Senate Bill 458. And that really takes House Bill 2001 to a new level with being able to provide homeownership opportunities. Next slide. So what does House Bill 2001 do? Well, it allows duplexes through quadplexes, cottage clusters, and townhomes on all lots and parcels that allow for the single family detached home product. For anything besides duplexes, those products are allowed in generally in areas that allow for single detached dwellings, but duplexes are allowed on every single lot and parcel for the most part throughout the state of Oregon, where a single family detached dwelling is currently allowed. This bill was really in response to the great housing shortage that we have in the state of Oregon and housing affordability concerns throughout, specifically throughout our greater Portland region. The bill is designed to offer more housing choices, diverse types of housing, and frankly, a supply to meet that shortage. And then the bill also frankly acknowledges the historic and frankly current exclusionary zoning practices that have had a legacy impact, ripple down effect from federal and state housing policies from the mid 1900s. So really trying to mitigate those exclusionary practices and allow more types of households to get into neighborhoods that they previously weren't able to. Next slide. So middle housing, per the legislation, needs to go through the same type of approval process that single family detached houses go through. In other words, regulations that apply to middle housing cannot be more burdensome than those that apply to single dwelling detached housing, whether it be through additional costs or review timelines or delays or oversight. And then the last bullet there talks about the clear and objective standards also that Mayor Snyder referenced that they adopted throughout their development code chapters, which require per the state statute that only clear and objective standards, conditions, and procedures can be applied to the regulation of the development of housing. Next slide. So where is this middle housing going to go? Well, per the state legislation, this is thanks to DLCD, Department of Land Conservation and Development, this funky little map. All your green circles are your or what's considered your large cities. and county urban areas. And then your medium cities are those in the blue triangles. So we'll get into what that means on the next slide. Medium cities had an effective date for allowing all those middle housing types a couple months ago, actually. And those size cities are 10,000, between 10,000 and 25,000. And they allow for duplexes on all of the lots and parcels that allow for single detached, like I said. Large cities are currently undergoing the local legislative acts and stakeholder involvement that will get them to adoption of local ordinances and resolutions that bring middle housing allowances into their code by next June of 2022. And those large cities, quote unquote, are determined to be those that have 25,000 people in them or more, or any city that's over 1,000 in population within Metro's urban growth boundary. There are some extensions and exceptions allowed. We're not going to get into the weeds on those. And then any of your homeowners associations with conditions, covenants, and restrictions that are currently existing, they don't force middle housing to come in there, but future homeowners associations will not be able to allow CC&Rs to restrict middle housing in the future. So just want to note that. Next slide. So just a little bit to define what our housing types we're going to be talking about today. Duplex, the state defined as 2 attached dwelling units, but cities may also define them as detached dwelling units. And that's really going to be important as we start talking about cottage clusters and your other single detached products that in plex type orientations that can become home ownership opportunities. Townhouses are dwelling units that are part of 2 or more, where each unit is located on its own lot or parcel, and they have to share a common wall. Next slide. Triplexes and quadplexes also, the state gave the local jurisdiction flexibility to define as detached configurations. So we're seeing that some of the medium-sized cities in the state of Oregon have done that with duplexes, and they've allowed them to be detached or attached. And we're really looking with anticipation toward the large cities to see how they're going to implement triplexes and quadplexes, whether they'll only be attached or they will could also be detached. And so similarly, cottage clusters are no fewer than 4 per acre, detached structures with a 900 square foot building footprint, orientated around a common courtyard. So that common space element needs to be there. And they can importantly be located on a single lot or parcel or on individual lots or parcels per House Bill 2001. Next slide. So we will skip this one since we're running a little bit low on time, but the main point is that middle housing can't be more arduous than single family detached. Next slide. Senate Bill 458 really got us closer to home ownership opportunities with middle housing. Allows for an expedited land division for the middle housing. Next slide. And really speeds up the timeline with which middle housing can be approved by the state and the local jurisdiction. Next slide. Key takeaways are if you're going to build middle housing per an expedited land division, you need to meet the building code of the state, the local jurisdiction's codes and standards, have your own utilities to each resulting structure on the lot or parcel, easement agreements for access and maintenance, and just 1 dwelling unit per resulting lot or parcel. And then the local government does have the flexibility to condition no further division of those lots that go through an expedited land division, and to also not allow an ADU if they could, but they don't have to. So with that framing of the middle housing overview, I want to hand it over to Jesse Russell with Hiatus Homes, who's going to walk us through his cottage clusters and the future for cottage clusters.
Hi, how are you guys? I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Okay, can everyone see that?
No, you'll need to put your slides in full screen, Jesse, seeing your desktop currently.
Oh. Well, then I won't be able to see my notes.
I'll pop your slides up on for you.
Okay, thanks. I'm not able to see the slides. Okay, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. Hi, everyone. As I've been introduced, my name is Jesse Russell. I'm the CEO of Hiatus Homes here in Bend, Oregon. And as was explained, we're talking about middle housing here in House Bill 2001 and House Bill 458. And these House bills are really amazing for us, really near and dear to our heart. We've been trying to create middle housing for over 5 years now and are starting to see a lot of traction here. So this has been really great. So I'm going to talk to you specifically about the cottage version of the middle housing and walk you through our first development here in Bend called Hiatus Benham as a case study to really show how you can use the cottage code to build a community. And then aside from our first project, I'll also present to you two of our other projects that go beyond the code changes that were required by 2001 and show how other, how other areas aside from Bend can adopt even more rigorous code to support middle housing. Next slide, please. So before we get into all that, I'd like to let you know a little bit about myself and our company, why we're a little bit different than most builders and developers. So Hiatus Homes is a land developer and a home builder, and we specialize in small, modern, highly efficient homes and communities. And we're advocates for people living in smaller houses. We believe there's a movement afoot that represents a fundamental shift in how people view housing and, more importantly, how they live their lives. So we believe that this movement that's happening right now, it's going to change our cities for the better now and into the future. And people are really wanting smaller, more efficient and environmentally friendly homes. So I think the first question, next slide, please, is if this is a market that, if this is the type of housing that we need and people are wanting, why are we not seeing more of that? And we have to go back in history a little bit. So after World War II ended, the 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in the suburbs was born. And at that time, most of the families that were, living in homes, buying homes, were made up of wife, husband, and 2 kids. So that's what got built. And this lasted for a long time. So even by the 70s, 40% of households were still this nuclear family. Next slide, please. So today, things have really shifted. Today, nuclear families only account for 20% of American households, while nearly 30% are single adults living alone. And this is a growing phenomenon across all ages and incomes. So our housing supply has been really slow to meet the demands of who's really living, buying, renting these houses these days. So these new groups include a variety of living arrangements. And the National Building Museum in DC had an exhibit, Making Room, Housing for a Changing America. And these are some of the stats. I'll just skip to the last two. 28% of people are just single people living alone. 25% are couples. So over 50% of the people don't need a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. So back to our original question, why aren't more houses being built for the changing demographic? Next slide, please. Well, innovation has been constrained, I think, for several reasons, but one of the major reasons is because the supply of housing is really low. And most builders and developers are operating in a seller's market. So basically, if they can still build what they've been building and keep selling it, why should they change? So here's some recent stats just from the bid market, which I think we're seeing this nationally, but our average sale price is now $650,000. To give you some context, my childhood home here in Bend, when my parents bought it in the late 80s, was $90,000. We're seeing just from last year a 30% increase in the cost of houses. So it's just been staggering, and we're seeing that nationally as well. Another huge hurdle, as we're all discussing today, has been the zoning and the building code. So in the past, building several homes on a residential lot instead of a big home, it just wasn't even really allowed. So, we started out as tiny house builders. Our first house was the hiatus. It was on an 8 by 20-foot trailer. You can see it down there in the corner. We were in the BIN design conference, and we wanted to show how, living in a tiny house community might work. So that upper right rendering, that's behind the library. We just wanted to see if we could do something like that. The city said absolutely not. And the problem really was density, not being able to put that many units in a residential standard zone. It just wasn't allowed at that point. So, but then in 2015, Ben adopted their version of the cottage code. When that happened, we were able to start into our first development, which was Hiatus Benham. Next slide, please. So I want to just take a quick pause here to kind of to explain the development process from the developer side of point of view, so then we can relate it back to these house bills and how they're helping. So you start out with your raw dirt. You look at that thing and you decide, is this going to work financially? And a big part of that is how many units can you fit on that land? And then you go through the entitlement process, which is asking the city, hey, can we do the plan that we're planning on doing? And that process, if you have debt on the land, can be a real problem, especially if it's taking a long time to get through the city. Just for an example, if you have to take debt on your land, if you have $1 million piece of land, which is not uncommon in Bend these days, if you're paying 12% on that money, it can be costing you up to $12,000 a month as you're trying to get these entitlements. So, with how can skip to the next slide real quick. So with House Bill 458, one of the huge thing that happens here is there's no appeals if you're within the code. That's a big deal because currently, if we're doing a development, someone can decide that they want to sue and they can slow the process down. That can start to cost us, around, in this scenario, $12,000 a month. There's no public hearing. We've had public hearings on all of our developments, and those can be really difficult. And then I think I'll skip just to the one that I think is so important, and that's the plan review going from 120 days to 63 days. That's a savings of 2 months, which is a huge deal for the bottom line of any development. So we can skip to the next slide. So I want to go through our cottage development that we did here in Bend. This is Hiatus Benham. So the big deal was the cottage code allowed us to have no minimum lot size, and it also allowed us, the new cottage code would allow for more units per acre. So on this particular piece of property, it was 3.2 acres. We were able to do 22 units there. These are 600 square feet cottages that are on foundations now. These cottages are arranged in clusters. So they're little half circles that you can see there around a common area. And the cottage development's designed really to facilitate the connection between the residents by connecting the communities by paths and a community garden. We have a pond in there. So it really becomes kind of its own neighborhood. Another thing that happened with this is the parking was reduced to 1 unit. If you multiply that out, if 22 units at 180 square feet, we're getting another couple lots out of that if we're able to only have one parking unit per unit. So that was really helpful as well. Next slide, please. This is just to show you kind of overall how the clusters work. We can skip to the next slide. So this was this development was a huge hit. It was received by the community really well after they actually saw what the houses looked like and what the community turned out to be. It was a financial success for the developer, for the investors and the developers as well. And the houses sold out in just over a year. So I think we really proved that this small cottage that's only 600 square feet with a lofted bedroom for that single person or that couple, that there's a lot of people out there that are looking for this. We can skip to the next slide. I'll skip through our energy efficiencies because we're slow on time, but I'd love it if you'd come to our website and check out what we've got going. So how do we help housing, this middle housing beyond 2001 and House Bill 458? Well, in Bend, we now have 4 variations of code that help for this. We have the small unit development code. We now have a micro apartment code, and we have 2 versions of the cottage code. And what this has really done in Bend is we have density incentives now. So 0 to 600 square foot houses are considered 0.25 of a larger house. 600 to 1200 is considered 0.5. And the reason that's important, if we're usually only getting 7 units per acre, we now multiply that, right? So now for a 600 square foot house, we're able to get up to 28 units on that property. So that's a huge deal for us. The Sdc scaling, we're experimenting with that right now as well. And that's based on that same unit calculation. So a 0 to 600 square foot house. And these numbers, I don't have the estimate perfectly, but usually it's $31,000 per house. For our 600 square foot house, that should go down to around 8,000. So that's a huge savings. Next slide, please. So I'll skip through this quickly because we're running out of time, but just quickly, the small unit development code on our hiatus 9th Street development. So that basically, we're doing ADUs as well. So we have 9 lots there with a cottage in the front and a ADU cottage in the back that has a garage on it. Only one parking space required per, so that was great. And then our Sdcs will be scaled, which is going to be really, really useful to make that pencil. That lot was 0.5 acres. It had 1 house on it. So we're now hopefully providing 18 houses for people in Bend. Next slide, please. This is our micro apartment. This is a big deal too, because the density, we were able to get double the density on this lot and go from a 20 unit apartment to a 40 unit apartment. The Sdcs, again, huge savings there. And we were actually only required 0.5 car parking spaces. We are providing 10 electric bike parking spaces, as well as a zip type car for the development. Next slide. We had to create a fund for this. So we have actually a highest capital fund because of the risk that's involved at the stage of having the land without developing the lots or having houses on it. So we've now mitigated that risk with having equity that holds our land. If anyone's interested in learning more about all this stuff, please get a hold of me. And sorry to rush through this. I just want to give time to our other presenters. So thanks very much, you guys. And yes, please contact me if you have any questions.
Thank you, Roseanne and Jesse, for painting a picture of exciting new as well as future housing opportunities. Jesse, I know there were a lot of questions and comments in the chat about sales price, so maybe you could go ahead and just pop the answers into there. Our next speakers, Karna Gustafson and Richard Casabaum, will discuss condominium mapping and walk us through a 6-unit condo case study. Karna Gustafson joined Vial Fotheringham's Oregon Law Office as an of-counsel attorney in 2020. Prior to joining VF, Karna spent more than 25 years at Land Bennett Bloomstein LLP, including 20 as partner, where she represented more than 1,000 Oregon and Washington homeowners associations in assessment collection, enforcement of covenants, document interpretation, and amending government documents. In addition, Karna worked with cities, counties, surveyors, banks, and the Oregon Real Estate Agency while representing developers and builders and drafting documents for condominiums, subdivisions, and planned unit development projects. Richard Casabaum is president of Bluestone Homes, a Metro Portland-based infill developer builder. As a native Oregonian who, as a teen, collected filberts on his grandpa's orchard and harvested potatoes at Bischoff Farms in rural Wilsonville, he has been building townhomes and small plexes in Portland for 30 years to accommodate the growing housing needs of our region. Thank you and welcome.
Good morning. My name is Karna Gustafson. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I'm going to go over condominiums, how they're created. It's a fairly long process, but I'm going to keep it kind of short here. There is a statute that governs condominiums. It's the only way that you can horizontally slice air to create a unit That does not include the land. It does require Oregon Real Estate Agency approval. It does require a condominium surveyor. And to describe the unit boundaries is what you need the surveyor for. On the right side of the screen, you can see a duplex condominium. We drew a box around each side of that building. So the entire structure, half of the structure is inside a unit, and the same with the other side. The land is considered common elements, which means that they all own, both unit owners own the land. However, the yards around each side are limited common elements for the exclusive use of those unit owners. Next slide, please. So this is the plat for that particular project that we just had up on the screen. As you can see, the dividing line and then the yards around each unit as the common elements. These had individual sewer lines into each side. However, if you can do these with one sewer line coming in, one water line coming in, the unit owners will then have to divide the bill for those services between the two of them. But it is possible to do this with only one sewer line. Next slide, please. So this is the condominium timeline for getting the approval of the project, as well as the drafting of the documents and the filing with the real estate agency. I'm not going to go over these individually. We don't have time today. My understanding is these presentations will be made available and will be on the websites of Metro and HBA Portland. But you can see that there are certain documentation that has to be drafted by the attorney. There's items that need to be ordered by the client within certain timeframes. On the notes below, if you're going to need a reserve study, which is if you have actually components that need to be maintained by the association, you need to do that well in advance, as those reserve study providers do take some time to get those done. The county is the one that reviews the condominium plat. That can take several months to get done by the county. This is a basic time frame that assumes there's not going to be any staging or variable property. Again, they need to, the developer would need to hire a private surveyor to measure those air spaces and those common elements around the building. Next slide, please. So this is the meat of this. You know, condominiums, like I said, are a creature of statute. So you have to use the statute to create them. But it does allow for home ownership of the middle housing versus rentals. So in other words, you have a duplex, triplex, or fourplex, you could actually divide those into home ownership properties. These condominium projects take a lot less time than asking, say, a city for a land division, which can sometimes take years. A condominium, a simple one, especially a middle housing one, can take 4 to 6 months. Sometimes it takes less time to get the condominium approved than it does to actually construct it. It is the only option if you only have one water, one sewer line going into the project. You can't do a land division. There's usually less infrastructure costs. Again, you don't have to put an actual road into county standards or city standards. You can do a driveway instead of a full-blown road. Senate Bill 458 that Roseanne talked about earlier will not work on existing structures. So if you have an existing duplex, triplex, or fourplex, you can condominiumize, which is not really a word, to these things. Next slide, please. Why condominiums for middle housing? Again, we talked about home ownership opportunities here in more geographic areas. Where there's been rentals that previously dominated, these can now be turned into condominiums for home ownership. Before you may have only been allowed to have a single family home in a subdivision. Now you may be able to have one of these parts of a middle housing structure of a plex. It also can act as a catalyst to support homeownership where housing type barriers in a particular jurisdiction have been removed to allow for this type of product. Next slide, please. An important part of the condominium process is it allows for the stacking of units. In other words, in a fourplex, you can have a ownership opportunity that doesn't include the land. So in other words, if you had 4 units, 2 above and 2 below, you can actually create home ownership, which you couldn't do with a land division. So this allows for a more efficient use of property. From a demographic equity perspective, if a certain household wants to own their home, it provides for that, preferable to renting. It just gives more home ownership opportunities, and that allows you to build equity. And if you intend to move up or enlarge your family or include other portions of your family, you can do this going through time, starting with a condominium project. Next slide, please. Oh, that was it. So thank you for your time. Sorry, it was a little quick. We want to, again, allow for other people to speak. But again, these presentations will be made available to you. Thank you. Oh, and now on to Richard Casabaum for his condominium presentation.
Am I on?
Yep.
Alrighty. Good morning. My name is Rich. I'm president of Bluestone Homes. I want to thank HBA and Metro for allowing me to give this presentation. I'm here to speak about a 6-plex condominium, which my business, Bluestone Homes, built in 2018. Next slide, please. What we're trying to do here in middle housing is it's about finding lots and parcels that are being underutilized and get the best efficiency out of them. As you can see from this slide, a proportion here, it was a 5,000 square foot lot. We purchased in approximately 2014. And we were able to, through the zoning of CM2, it was originally a parking structure surrounded by houses. So we were able to do the zoning, able to get 6 units on this project. And each unit had 2 bedrooms and a major open space for living and dining. Next slide. Again, our goal was to create middle housing, which was affordable, and through programs with the Portland Housing Bureau, we were able to select a product that would be available through the Holding program, where both the builder and the buyer, or it's a win-win situation where the builder gets reduced SDC fees waived, and the buyer gets reduced taxes on the improvements of the home. Our price ranges, we kept them low in order to meet this multi program, and we were able to create 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, just under 1,000 square feet. And they also had in the back had a great big common area, which is about 20 by 50 feet wide with benches and sitting areas. And then we gave them each a covered patio, which was about 7 feet to 8 feet deep and 15 feet wide. It was close to amenities near to Montevilla. We had bike parking, but no on off-street parking. Next slide, please. Our vision for the project was to create a design which was modern, open, with a lot of natural light. As you can see, we had whites and grays colors there with some warmer tones. Our goal was to create each individual unit to be separate on its own in terms of its design. So we partnered with an interior designer. So each home features different colors and designs and materials. Some of the upgrades were quartz counters, stainless steel appliances. We wanted to make this feel like a home that people could be proud of, separated from an idea of being an apartment. Being in a stacked situation like this, a lot of walls are shared, so you have built-in energy efficiencies. And in addition to that, we provided what's called mini splits, or no ductless heating, which creates both air conditioning and heating in one unit, also called mini splits. Next slide, please. Our buyers, again, we were looking to make this affordable for our market and for our buyers, and by the ability to create 6 units spread out over one piece of ground, rather than like say 3 units, we could spread the cost out for each unit. Many of our buyers were first-time buyers. Most of them were in their 20s or 30s for individuals. And then we had a single parent with a child that was downsizing, and then another one sold to a couple in their 30s. Next slide. We had option to go with like either a single family house, or we could go with townhouses or condominiums. And due to the zoning and the site size and whatnot, we chose to go with condominiums over the townhouses. It gave us a product that would be more affordable and gave us the best use of the land. This was, therefore we could pass this on to our customers. So while the market probably prefers a fee simple product, such as a townhome where you own the land and the home, condos are one way where you can create best utilization of the land in a 6-plex, and everybody has an opportunity to get in, and it's a way to start and keep the house price down. Next slide. Again, some of the challenges of condominiums versus like a townhouse or a single family home is that during market downturns, they tend to be the first ones to lose their value, or at least lose their appreciation. And they're quite often the last ones to rise back up with their value. There's also various legal risks in condominiums, because when you have like many people living in one building, and if there happens to be a defect, that can cause a legal action. And if you have a lot of people, they can create a class action suit against you. So everyone involved in the project, from the builders to the trades, engineers, is somewhat exposed to this. And so you have to keep that in mind. There's a little more legal risk in putting together condominiums. There's also certain budget pressures. As soon as you go into units that are 4 or more, you go into a commercial code. So you have additional safety and engineering features you have to take into account. Fire sprinklers, geotechnical surveys. So there's a few more hoops, you might say, boundaries, hurdles to hop over, both from a legal standpoint and administrative. There's trade-offs you're going to have with stacked units like this. Is difficult to get parking versus a single family house. And buyers tend to prefer parking if they can get it. So that's a challenge. And so you want to try to locate these in areas where the buyer has close proximity to amenities. There's also usually less personal space in a condominium, and you don't have quite often you don't have a backyard. So there are also, the larger the structure you build, you might say the more risk you have legally. You want to be able to make sure you get your project put into an insurance product that is like what we call a wrap, so that one project is not going to take you down on other projects. Next slide. However, I'd like to end this on a high note that there's a lot of opportunities, I feel, in the market for condominiums. It is another form of home ownership that does well in an amenity-rich location where the neighborhood is close to shops and restaurants and other infrastructure that you might not need if you don't have a car. I also really feel that the smaller plex are probably more attractive to buyers because it's a little more homey feel. It's not a very big complex where you're involved with 20, 30, 40 other homeowners. And it also happens to be a little more manageable for a builder that's a single family builder that wants to kind of move into a middle housing, doing condos. It's a little more manageable first step. The larger complexes can yield a better economy of scale and help set more affordable attainable prices. There's some other advantages to having a homeowner association where all your maintenance and your ground maintenance and sometimes your part of the building maintenance is taken care of, and people feel good that they don't have to worry about that. I feel in the future that there's a great opportunity for middle housing opportunities where you would have a detached product similar to what Hiatus Homes builds, whether it be in a cluster or not. And because the closer you can make the home look and feel like a individual single family home, the more market share you'll get and more people will want to come to your product. Fee simple is obviously the most desired, but if you can make a hybrid that is a condominium, but is still detached and doesn't share walls with anyone else, that is a great opportunity and a great compromise for people who want to get in and have an affordable place to live.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard and Karna, for both walking us through the logistics of middle housing condominiums. Next up, we will hear from Susan Brown on the important topic of financing strategies for middle housing. Susan Brown is a consultant with Core SGB, a firm consulting and a range of private and conventional financing options for all types of housing. Prior to starting her consultant business, she worked for Umpqua Bank for over 16 years, most recently as Senior Vice President of Residential Construction and Renovation Loan Production. In this capacity, she focused on construction loan production for two important housing types, ADUs and manufactured homes. Susan is a certified mortgage banker and accredited mortgage professional. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to participate both to Metro and the HBA. Terrific information, and hope I can contribute some valuable information today. I want to talk quickly about some financing strategies for middle housing. Someone asked me a couple of days ago when I was presenting on this topic, is the financing world ready for all of the new zoning and middle housing opportunities that are coming before us? And I laughed louder than I anticipated laughing and said, no, they aren't. However, conversations like this, conversations with the capital markets that supply and oversee Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and other policy makers and legislators are involved in these conversations too. And because of that, I'm hopeful about what will be available as things continue. I want to start with some very brief history, very brief. Prior to 2008, banks and more conventional sources of financing provided money for this type of housing to be built. Duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes on a speculative basis, meaning developers who were building the projects for resale later. Following the financial crisis in 2008, only about 20% of those funds are now coming from banks. So I want to talk a little bit about conventional financing and unconventional financing and what those are shaping up like right now. I also want to take a moment to define owner-occupied, non-owner, and developer-builder. An owner-occupied property is one where the person who owns the property is the one who wants to do the development, and they would be living on that property. A non-owner occupied property is someone who wants to purchase or construct one of these projects for investment purposes and would continue to hold that property in their portfolio as a rental asset investment. Developers and builders are those who would own the land, develop it on a speculative basis, and then sell the properties after the project is complete. Right now, conventional sources of money are things like banks, credit unions, and independent mortgage banks. There's not a big difference from the outside of how those things work, but from the inside, the way that they use and get their funds is kind of the differentiator of how those come together. Typically, people who are going to use these conventional sources of money are individual homeowners who are building or remodeling their existing dwelling. Generally, they'll stay as an owner occupied because right now there are very few options for investment construction if you don't live on the property. Those cash, the resources, sources of funds, cash, just taking money out of your bank account, borrowing money from a relative, borrowing money from a retirement savings plan, cash out refinances, home equity lines of credit on the subject property, and then construction loans that can be either what's called a two-time close or a one-time close. And I won't go into a lot of detail on each of those product types, but if you want more information, I'm always happy to talk offline or in the Q&A section more about what those actually are. Those conventional sources of funds right now are typically available for single family properties only. New construction and renovation, owner occupied, as I mentioned. One of the very interesting things right now is for the ADUs, most conventional financing that I'm familiar with right now will accommodate only one ADU for properties. So as we begin to look at these that have multiple ADUs, right now there are no permanent financing sources available for those, but we'll talk about that hopeful stuff here in a few minutes. Loan amounts right now in the conventional space go up to $548,250 in our market, and that's basically money through Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, and some portfolio funds at some banks. But trying to get a bank that does construction lending and has a portfolio is a rare combination indeed. So looking at sources to create new middle housing, and some of the ways that developers, non-owner occupied, and speculative transactions can take place are available through folks who specialize in connecting capital to projects. And our first speaker today talked about an equity fund that was put together specifically for their product, which is becoming and is a very common source for these funds. They're available on a growing basis, and more money is flowing to these funds. And we'll talk in just a couple of minutes more about the phenomenon that's happening there. Right now, for folks who are building, builders and developers and those who are doing investment type properties, their sources are different. Cash, of course, borrowing from a relative. They too could borrow from retirement funds. Line of credit on a different property. So you're collateralizing some other piece of property to loan on the subject property. There's what's called a guidance line that opens up for construction on a specific project with multiple phases or multiple lots in the project. Construction loans typically are going to be a two-time close in nature, one for the construction portion and then one for the permanent takeout portion of the financing. And that's when we move into the space next of private investors and social impact investors. Those funds are typically available for not only just buy and flip type transactions, but also for the interesting and new duplex, triplex, and fourplex creation, the creation of multiple ADUs, the creation of cottage clusters. And all of these are generally going to be for a non-owner occupied transaction. Most of the private equity type lenders do not loan for owner occupied transactions because the regulations and disclosure requirements for that type of transaction are more onerous and harder to do. And part of the beauty of this private capital market space is that the regulations are much, much lower. So the funds that are available now and in a quickly growing space are private equity funds, social investing funds, wealth funds, and hedge funds. And these types of capital sources have sometimes in the past been called hard money. And in fact, in some cases, the interest rates can go as high as 12 or 14%. But what's really fascinating is the flow of capital into these funds. There's a lot of money that people want to invest in housing because they understand that there is a strong demand and a low supply for housing right now. And so money is flowing in. As the money flows in, those people and funds who offer money have to get more competitive. If they want to loan their money, they're finding that they're having to reduce their interest rate to the builders and developers and investors. So as more money flows in, the interest rates drop. What's fascinating about that is as the money flows in, the more conventional sources of funds like banks and credit unions are going to see that demand is high and potentially be inspired and tempted back into the marketplace that would allow for money to go back to conventional sources rather than just being in the private space. This grid that's put together is just a quick recap of conventional versus unconventional financing snapshot that will be available to you if you choose to get copies of this presentation. That pretty much wraps up my comments, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end, should there be any.
Thank you, Susan. Very helpful discussion about financing of these housing types. Our final presenter this morning is Sean Edging, who will introduce jurisdictional incentives for middle housing. Sean Edging is a housing policy analyst at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. He received his master's in urban and regional planning from Portland State University in 2018. He joined the agency in 2020 to assist in the rulemaking and implementation of House Bill 2001 for middle housing and House Bill 2003 for housing needs analyses and production strategies, both of which passed in the 2019 legislative session. Thank you, Sean, and welcome.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Miranda, for the introduction. And thank you for inviting me to speak here today. So my name is Sean Edging. I'm going to be talking about a kind of niche provision of House Bill 2001 that we refer to as the affordability considerations. I think it's kind of interesting that I'm talking at the Home Builders Association presentation, and I'm the only bureaucrat on the actual docket, and I'm actually going last, which I think is a pretty funny order of things to do. But I did want to preface this conversation. So it's a pretty small part of House Bill 2001 that I was asked to present on. And initially, I was pretty hesitant to talk about it because I felt like the outcomes of the affordability considerations would be disappointing for a presentation. But I actually wanted to use this presentation as an opportunity to get across a very important point that I hope I'm able to convey. And that's that House Bill 2001 is a very important milestone in addressing the production and affordability crisis that we see statewide today. But I want to emphasize that it cannot be and it should not be the only policy solution that is intended to address this crisis. There are a lot more things, a lot more systemic factors that affect the production and affordability of housing that's happening at the state level that I want to highlight kind of as part of this presentation that I don't think you'll see just by focusing on House Bill 2001. So with that, let's dive into this. So obviously, I'm not going to go over again what Roseanne very well kind of laid out in terms of what House Bill 2001 allows, but I will not pass up an opportunity to share this slick graphic. But in short, what we're talking about here is not just re-legalizing, but promoting the development of a lot of housing types, which, as you guys have seen in these presentations today, don't really have a niche in the housing market yet as a result of institutional and market-based factors that have kind of prevented them from being an option for not just developers, but people who actually consume housing in general. And before I talk about the specific affordability considerations for jurisdictions, I wanted to preface this with a little bit of the statewide context for where this policy, where House Bill 2001 sits in the statewide landscape. Specifically, the one that I think all of us have kind of talked about today in some form or another, and that's that we're in a very severe housing shortage. Obviously, these numbers that you see right in front of you are the result of a prototype methodology that the state ran, that OHCS, Oregon Housing and Community Services ran, called the Regional Housing Needs Analysis. And I'll talk about that in a little minute. But it really kind of encapsulates the severe shortage that we're seeing in our state today. These numbers might not necessarily mean a lot to the average person, but the way I've heard it best characterized is that if we were really trying to dig ourselves out of the hole of just meeting up with demand that exists today over the next 5 years, we would essentially need to double market rate production and triple subsidized housing, subsidized affordable housing production, which is a very significant institutional hurdle that exists today. And House Bill 2001 is one piece to kind of address that shortage. And additionally, and I'm not going to talk about this in as much justice as it needs, but we're also trying to address a lot of the market interacting with regulatory factors that have created an environment where housing is getting increasingly larger and less affordable, in spite of the fact that the average household is going down as a result of kind of demographic changes over time, right? So there's all these factors, and these aren't the only factors that are affecting the housing market today, but these are part of the things that we're trying to essentially address in terms of housing underproduction and the fact that we're trying to incentivize the provision of smaller and ostensibly more affordable housing options for folks. And so with that, what are these affordability considerations? It's a pretty small and actually often kind of forgotten part of the bill. And what it requires is for a local government, it requires a local government shall consider, and that's a pretty important phrase, ways to increase the affordability of middle housing by considering policies, including but not limited to, and it lists 3 options. 1 being waiving or deferring system development charges, 2 being adopting or amending property tax exemptions, and the 3rd is assessing a construction excise tax, ostensibly to promote the development of affordable housing, to promote finance of that option. And as you can imagine, right, with House Bill 2001, we're asking local jurisdictions to do a significant amount of work when it comes to amending their local codes, revising zoning standards to allow, enable, and even promote the development of middle housing. And a lot of jurisdictions already have policies like these on the books, especially for things like subsidized affordable housing development. But you can imagine that if you are already engaging in all of these policy conversations on how you just legalize and re-allow middle housing in your community, all of these different efforts are going to require significant process, policy conversations, and just development to actually get them implemented in the first place. And the requirement in the bill is that you shall consider it, right? And so I think the outcome has been one that might be a little bit unsurprising, if maybe not a little bit disappointing, is no changes are proposed. And I know a lot of you guys might already be thinking like, well, that's really disappointing. Why did you present on this topic? And actually, I don't think that's the most important part of this phrase, even though I underlined it for you. The follow-up that we often hear to this is that the city or cities are going to be engaging in a process called the housing production strategy in the future. Well, they'll take up this issue and other issues to incentivize not just the development of middle housing, but housing options throughout the board. And this is actually pretty important because the housing production strategy is a systemic change that is in addition to House Bill 2001 that requires cities not just to consider SDCs, to consider property tax exemptions, and to consider construction excise taxes, but to consider a whole range of different types of strategies that they could consider, a whole range of actions that a local jurisdiction can take to promote the affordability and development of housing. And they have to do this once every either 6 years or 8 years. And in addition to that, they're not just required to consider it, they're actually required to do something about it. They're required to adopt strategies that address a housing need that they've identified within their city, right? So there are systemic factors that are changing in our statewide landscape that you wouldn't see if you were just looking at House Bill 2001, but are going to have a very significant long-term impact on the development and affordability of housing over time. And I want to also emphasize that this doesn't just stop there. House Bill 2003, with this housing production strategy, that's a piece that's already been implemented that is going to shape the way that cities plan for housing in the future and promote affordability. But it's not the only thing that's underway. There's a lot of really exciting things that are happening that are starting to ask these questions of like, hey, how are we systemically planning for housing, and how is that affecting how we can reach affordable, equitable, and fair housing outcomes? Now, obviously, a big topic of this conversation has been SDCs and public facilities financing, right? And one of the biggest things that I wanted to highlight is that this is something that we are starting to realize is one of the biggest factors that affect the affordability and production of housing, right? The way that we plan for and finance public facilities, right? And adequate public facilities. And that's something that Oregon Housing and Community Services is currently taking up in a report where they look at the interactions between specifically SDCs and housing development and affordability. And I think of it as the beginning in a series of conversations on how we approach public facilities financing. Meanwhile, if you guys remember those big scary numbers that I showed you earlier from the regional housing needs analysis, another big factor that we kind of came to a conclusion to as part of this process is the way that we plan for housing systemically is not equipped to respond to this incredibly great need. And in fact, we're kind of, the way it's set up currently digs us deeper and deeper into this hole, and it actually entrenches patterns of inequity. So we're currently in the process of seeing, well, what changes can we make to that system to encourage and promote and ultimately reach the outcomes of more affordable, fair, and equitable housing outcomes. And that's what I wanted to highlight, is that if you were to just look at House Bill 2001, you'd be like, well, I mean, gosh, that doesn't, I mean, there's so many problems and this doesn't seem like it addresses it all. But I want to highlight that there's so many other systemic and institutional factors that are currently, either have been changed or reformed or currently in the process of being looked at in a much deeper and more kind of robust way than has been in the past. And so with that, I think I'll just end there, and I would love to just dive into the discussion and see the questions that folks have.
Thank you, Sean. And thanks again to all the presenters for such great information and thought-provoking presentations today. I have been keeping notes and tracking the Q&A, and we're going to do our best to cover as many questions as we can with our remaining time. A few of them have actually been answered, but by presenters individually, so you can go there to find more information. But I may still ask a few of them for the benefit of all of us to hear some of what these great experts have to say. So I'm going to start. There was a lot of interest about deferring SDCs and reducing SDCs. So I thought I would just start with a question about when jurisdictions reduce those SDCs or defer them or shorten the time frame for entitlement. How do we ensure and guarantee that the cost savings associated with those things to the developer are actually passed directly to the future homeowner?
So I'll take a stab at that, and then Jesse can chime in. Usually when we see them directly passed on dollar for dollar is in a capital A affordable type development project that is government subsidized and it has deed restrictions on the persons that can purchase it, on how much they can earn. Otherwise, I don't see how in a market rate development, but then again, those SDC reductions aren't intended necessarily usually for market rate product. They're usually provided for incentives to build the affordable housing at usually anywhere from 30% of AMI up to 120% of AMI. Area median income, for those of you who don't know what AMI is. Jesse?
Yeah, so for us, we're not an affordable with a capital A builder. And the way that we've looked at it is there's projects that just wouldn't, the micro apartment project, for instance, for us, if the SDCs wouldn't have been scaled, we wouldn't have been able to do the project. So I think it has, to us, it's about creating more inventory. And when we create a product that's a new product, like a cottage or a micro apartment or something that hasn't been in the market before, we feel like it's very important for us to put more money into the finishes and really put a lot of money into the design as well. And I think sometimes what happens with us, because we're in a free market, is it almost gets designed too well. I mean, our cottages went from 270,000, one just resold. These are 600 square foot cottages. They resold for $400,000. So when you look at the per square footage cost, it's I think it's astronomical. But we're in a free market for us. If you want to do affordable housing with a capital A, there's a process to that, but we don't do that. We assume that if we can continue to champion this type of housing and do it really well, that other builders will start to do this, and other builders, maybe including ourselves, will start to value engineer these. And SDCs are something that can help with that. They're also, for us, it was just a thing of looking at a lot. If you could put one house on a 4,000 square foot lot and you weren't allowed to put 4 houses on there before, that house had no minimum bedrooms, bathrooms, cars, how many people lived in it. So it's possible for there to be a set, a car or a house that has 7 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, and there's, people living in that. And we're not asking for us to get, we're just asking if what the city would have gotten on that same lot previously, 30,000, that's split among 4 smaller houses that are never going to have more than 1 bathroom. So I'm not saying that the way that we're looking at this is perfect, but it's the way we've tried to attack a problem that I think needs multiple answers.
That's an awesome answer, Jesse. And if I just wanted to add one thing as somebody kind of on the regulatory side of things. And this is one thing I've been noticing a lot in this conversation is like, are we yes SDCs or no SDCs? And really it's not a very, it's when we think about the question of public facilities finance, obviously we need to make sure that we have adequate public facilities financing that ensure people are served adequately, by infrastructure, and they have their infrastructure needs met. But I think one thing that we are taking an increasing focus on, especially at the state level with this SDC methodology, is how do we structure that, and how do that actually affect the outcomes that we see in terms of what housing is developed, what incentives exist there for housing, and who ultimately kind of pays those costs, right? If they disproportionately affect different people in different ways based on how they're assessed and calculated, right? So I think this is kind of an ongoing conversation. I don't think we'll be able to solve that as part of this, but I do want to mention that like the conversation around public facilities finance and SDCs is one that's like constantly evolving, and something where I think people are really learning a lot as we start to focus our energy in on this conversation.
Thank you, everyone. So there was another really interesting question in the Q&A that I think might be directed to Karna and Susan. And folks are interested if you could discuss the potential benefits and viability of cooperative housing, for example, as an alternative form of home ownership that may be more affordable and doesn't require individual mortgage financing. And could maybe go through a community land trust or not. Is that something you could speak to?
So we have an example, I've seen an example in the city of Bend on the community land trust where they continue to hold, again, as a nonprofit, hold the land and then sell the homes in a leasehold situation, which brings the cost down because they don't need to include the cost of the land in the sale of the home. So that is a fairly successful way, but it still is small potatoes for solving the problem. The co-op example, I think last time I looked, there might only be 2 actual co-ops in the state of Oregon that are actually done. So one of which I represent that association. It's not easy because you're selling shares, and managing the building and everything is not for the faint of heart. So while it may potentially be a solution, I think developers are less likely to enter into stuff that's just not been tried and tested in Oregon, where there's examples of it. Susan, did you have any further comments on it?
Yeah, first off, Karna, good job kind of recapping the scarcity of that project type here in Oregon. It's a well-known and often used type of home ownership on the East Coast. It's been used there for a long time. Because of that, there are, I'm going to call it takeout loans for those individual units in a co-op. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and FHA all have loans available for the individual unit to be purchased after the co-op is established. But the funding to create a co-op is extremely limited right now. It's generally for quite larger projects, and the funding isn't readily available for smaller projects that are probably more what we're looking for. So I think there's still this tension between interest and potential demand and the availability of the funds to get that done.
Thank you both. We have a few kind of logistical questions about some of the legislation that I think would be helpful to clarify for some of our audience. One is with Senate Bill 458, if you own a single family home today, can you create another fee simple lot, or does it require bare land to divide first? For example, could the owner sell her backyard if a home already exists?
Sean, I'm
Yeah,
gonna
would
let
you
you
like me
take
to
that
address
one.
that? Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, so in order for a parcel to be eligible for a Senate Bill 458 land division, they have to demonstrate that they essentially have to demonstrate that whatever middle housing type they propose is in compliance with House Bill 2001 and associated administrative rules. So essentially they have to have a middle housing, have proposed a middle housing type that is in compliance with all of the applicable requirements. They can't just divide up their lot and sell off a piece to somebody to build some other, maybe middle housing type later off in the future. They have to demonstrate that the resultant development will be in compliance with House Bill 2001 and local codes that were adopted in compliance with 2001.
And just to piggyback, there's nothing in Senate Bill 458 that would preclude that individual from going into their local jurisdiction, proposing a middle housing development in their backyard, as long as it met the local code and the building code, and then having an expedited land division applied to that proposal for middle housing. So the bill does not preclude that, so which is exciting.
Yeah, and that would include accessory dwelling units, correct?
Actually, unfortunately, at this point, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, are not defined by House Bill 2001 as a middle housing type. However, for those of you who love advocacy work, that is something that we are working on as an industry with Metro, with other small housing promoters across the industry, both affordable and market rate, to get that ADU included in the definition of middle housing, such that accessory dwelling units could become a home ownership opportunity.
Thank you for the clarification, Roseanne. Susan, did you have something to add?
Yes, I did, but I think that Roseanne may have just addressed it, so I think I'm good. Thanks.
Okay, great. Another clarifying question is, if I've already developed and built a cottage cluster that is not fee simple, can I retroactively apply an expedited land division to divide up the land and sell each cottage separately?
Again, I think I can take this one. So again, it depends on whether the cottage cluster is developed in compliance with House Bill 2001. If you can demonstrate that, then you would be eligible for a Senate Bill 458 land division. But let's say this was maybe a cottage code that was developed prior to House Bill 2001, and it might not be in compliance with all the pieces. If you can't demonstrate that that cottage cluster is in compliance with House Bill 2001 and locally adopted codes, then you wouldn't be eligible for a land division under Senate Bill 458. Unless the jurisdiction established a process that allowed you to do that.
Great. And I think one final question, just because there was a lot of interest in affordable housing, is that, as we've noted today, building new, even if smaller homes is often still cost prohibitive when it's on the market. Are there examples or recommendations from our panelists today on how to build affordable middle housing options for our residents?
I think we need to define the definition of affordable. Every jurisdiction's affordability is different. The AMI, area median income, is different, in Lake Oswego than it is in Portland. And so if you're trying to create housing that's below that 120% of AMI, which is usually nurses, firefighters, teachers, those types of jobs, almost always, those need to be subsidized somehow, either by a nonprofit, a land trust model, Habitat for Humanity. There's other, I think, for-profit ones as well, but that build strictly for affordable housing. Housing Works. I'm trying to think of some others. I'm sure there's a bunch out there, but unless you get some subsidy either by a nonprofit or the government, you can't build affordable housing, capital A. It's just not, it's not possible without some help. And I think Susan's financing options showing you how much it costs to get construction financing, shows you how there's just not a lot of options. Investors don't want to invest unless they're going to make money. And so if you can't build it out of pocket, you need investment money, and they want a return on their investment.
Thank you. Well, unless Rebecca had anything to add, I think that our time is up today. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude this webinar. I just want to say thank you again to Mayor Snyder and to all of our speakers. A wise man once said, far and away, the best prize that life has to offer is the chance to work hard at work worth doing. And I just want to note that this is definitely work worth doing. So thank you to each of you for joining us today and for the work that you do each day to see more accessible and inclusive housing built in our communities. And again, this will be available through the HBA and Metro websites.